Here's the reason why I wrote the book, Answering Jihad, which is out there. When I see jihad being waged, immediately there are two polar responses. Like the thing could still be happening and the shooting could still be underway. And there's two responses that seem to come up immediately, every time and again. It's some people saying, how dare you say that this has anything to do with Islam? Islam is a religion of peace. This person is obviously not a Muslim. You cannot ascribe to Islam the jihad that's happening here. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you have people immediately saying, we should get rid of the Muslims. This is what's happening. The more of them that come, the more we're endangering our country. Close our borders. Get rid of all of them. All Muslims are inherent threats. Those kinds of statements. The two pop up immediately. And I think of the first one, and the first one is, of course, all of our national leaders. Francois Hollande has said it. David Cameron has said it. Barack Obama has said it in the middle of jihad being waged. And the worse it gets, the more loudly they say it. Islam is a religion of peace. And people have kind of had it with that rhetoric. No, that's not making any sense of what's going on. We've been seeing this since 2001. Those of us who were watching saw it earlier. This obviously has a lot to do with Islam. And of course, the guys who are doing the killing are saying we're doing this because Islam tells us to. And then on the other side of the spectrum, I think, wait a minute. If you got your way, if you were able to stop all refugees from coming into the United States, or all Muslims from coming into the United States, then I wouldn't be here. And I would have never met the Lord. And the best thing that's ever happened to me has been the gospel. And I wouldn't have known it. So we need to somehow begin to find out how to answer jihad more appropriately. And that's why I got the title of my book, Answering Jihad, A Better Way Forward. I'm not proposing that I have the definitive answer to jihad. But we got to begin by understanding what it is and then move forward in order to formulate a response. If you try to diagnose something and you get it wrong, your solution is not going to work. And so what Obama has done is he's tried to, from the very moment he became president, he gave the speech in Cairo telling all the Muslims that I see it as my duty as the president of the United States to fight negative stereotypes of Islam wherever they occur. Quote. Well, that's interesting because technically we shouldn't be fighting to defend ideologies. We should be fighting to defend people. And somehow we have conflated Muslims with Islam. It's obvious how that happened, but it's also obvious that should not happen. Muslims have rights. Muslims are people. Muslims are created in the image of God. Islam is an ideology. Islam is a religion, open to being criticized. So you can criticize Islam while loving Muslims. And in fact, the only real way to criticize Islam as a Christian should be while we're loving Muslims. So people can see it's not out of hatred for the people. It's out of concern for those very people we love that we discuss the problem of the ideology. So that's the very first step in teasing out what's happening. We have to somehow, and again, like I said, we're still formulating how to do this, but a better way forward starts with understanding the difference between the people and the ideology. Muslims who are loved, created in the image of God, and the ideology, Islam. What does Islam actually teach? If we just come out and say Islam is a religion of peace, what does that mean? Because I'll tell you what, the words Islam is a religion of peace were not found anywhere until the mid-20th century. You don't find that in the Quran, you don't find that in Hadith, and as far as people have researched, you cannot find that in any Islamic book until the mid-20th century, when Muslims are trying to make their faith more appealing to Westerners. Specifically in India is where we see it first. The British are ruling India, and they're beginning to have these conversations with Muslims, and Muslims are trying to make Islam more appealing. Fact of the matter is, The Hadith say nothing like that. The Quran says nothing like that. So let's go back and take a look at what Islam teaches. Actually, before we do that, let's try to define what Islam is. Sociologically speaking, many people want to define Islam as that religion in some loose sense that Muslims believe, right? You've heard that definition before. Islam is a religion that Muslims believe. What's the problem with that definition? What's the problem with that definition? You don't need to raise your hand, just say stuff. It's very broad. What else? Every Muslim has different sets of beliefs. You ask people in this room what they think about eschatology, about how the world will end, and you start asking for details, I guarantee you, almost every single one of us will have different responses. Is that all Christianity? It's problematic to define a religion by what people believe. Let's put that in a little bit broader terms. What you get from your neighbor who is, not wearing a hijab, who calls herself a Muslim, and who's proud to be a Muslim, like The Muslim Next Door. Have you seen that book? It's by a Muslim woman. She's not wearing a hijab, but she's writing a whole book about being an American Muslim. Her Islam is very different from the mullahs and the ayatollahs and the muftis. Their Islam is very different from hers, and their Islam is very different from each other's too. Some are Shia, some are Sunni, some are Salafi, some are Wahhabi. You've got different sets of beliefs amongst these people. So it's problematic to define a religion based on what its adherents believe. So how should we define a religion? And this, by the way, is a very problematic, it's a thorny issue in religious studies, how you do this. But my suggestion is that we ought to consider a religion in the context from which it arose. So in the case of Christianity, you think of Christianity as the religion that rose in the context of Judaism and Greco-Roman pagan religion of the first century. And you think, well, Christianity was different from the pagans and the Greco-Romans in that it believes in the one God of the Hebrew Bible, but at the same time, it's different from the Jews in that it believes in the risen Messiah, who is Lord. That's how you define Christianity. The faith in which people believe in the one God of the Jewish Bible, but they believe that he is Jesus, risen from the dead. That's Christianity. With Islam then, how would you define Islam? Again, if you look at it historically, it's the religions, it's the teachings taught by Muhammad that he is a prophet of Allah, the one true God, as taught through the Quran. That's how you define Islam. Many people are going to have many interpretations of the Quran. Many people are going to have many different views of what Muhammad might have said or might not have said. But that's where you start from. Are you with me so far? I'm trying to start from the basics. I can see you, by the way. So if you nod, it would be helpful to me. Are you with me so far? Great. Okay, so if we define Islam then as the teachings of Muhammad and the Quran, then in order to understand whether or not Islam is a religion of peace, where should we go? To the Quran and to Muhammad's life. When you look through the Quran, you see a dappled image. You see at certain places, peace is embodied. For example, Surah Al-Baqarah, Ayah 256, La ikraha fi din, there is no compulsion in religion. In other words, you can't force someone to believe something. Fairly peaceful. Surah Al-Kafirun, Qul ya ayyuhal kafirun, say, O you who disbelieve, I do not worship that which you worship, you do not worship that which I worship. You go ahead and worship that which you want, and let us worship that which we want. Can't we all just get along? That's basically what the Quran surah says. Fairly peaceful. So you have those kinds of sections of the Quran, no doubt. Then you have also other sections of the Quran, such as chapter 9 of the Quran, verse 5. Slay the infidels wherever you find them, lay siege to them and take them captive. Not peaceful. Then you have passages like Surah 9:29, fight the Jews and Christians until they pay the ransom tax and feel humiliated or feel subdued. Not peaceful. Specifically, why do you fight them? Chapter 9, verse 30. So the very next verse says you fight them because the Jews believe Ezra is the Son of God, the Christians believe Jesus is the Son of God, Allah's curse be on them. Interesting. So, just to give you a little bit of insight, chapter 9, verse 5 says, slay the infidels. It's literally the polytheists, wherever you find them. So, Here you have kill the polytheists, and then when it comes to Jews and Christians, it's fight them until they pay the poll tax and feel humiliated, because why? They believe in sons of God, so they're just as bad as polytheists. That's interesting. We'll come back to that in just a moment. So how do we reconcile this? Now, in the Bible, at times it seems like there are things that might contradict each other, but we reconcile them, don't we? We try to find ways to say, okay, this explains that, and that explains this, therefore this is how we understand it. That happens in all religious traditions. There are things that seem to have some tension, and if you're unfriendly to that religion, you just say, oh, contradiction, contradiction. But if you're friendly to that religion, you say, let me figure this out. How does this work? So how do Muslims, being friendly to their own faith, say, well, we've got violent verses here and we have peaceful verses here. How do we reconcile this? Here's what happens. This is to help you understand how some Muslims can get up and say Islam is a religion of peace, while the Quran says what it does, and while other Muslims are killing people in the name of jihad. Here's how you understand what's happening. The Muslims in the West are saying those violent passages exist in a certain context. And those guys obviously don't understand the peaceful nature of Islam. They're taking those verses out of context and they're enacting jihad ignorantly. They don't represent Islam. Are you with me? That's what Muslims in the West will say. Do they believe it when they say that? Yes, they do. They're not lying, usually. We shouldn't go around assuming people are lying. Maybe some are, but the vast majority of them, certainly I, when 9/11 happened, said exactly that, and I meant it. And most Muslims that I meet do think that. Now, on the flip side, you have those Muslims who are engaging in jihad. And they're seeing the same passages, and they're seeing the peaceful passages, and they're saying, no, the peaceful passages are the ones that do not apply. These are the ones that do apply. Who's right and who's wrong? How do we determine this? It really depends on your hermeneutic. The way Muslims have consistently understood Islam and the Quran and the Hadith from the beginning of the Islamic era is that the hermeneutic you apply is the life of Muhammad. How do you understand the Quran? You look at Muhammad's life, and that will help you understand the Quran. Are you with me? So that's how Muslims understand it. There's so much we could say here, but let's just take that and move on. In order to understand what the Quran teaches, you have to look at it through the lens of Muhammad's life. And that's why the Hadith are so important to most Muslims. If you look at the life of Muhammad, here's what happens. Early on, he claims to be a prophet when he's 40 years old. For 3 years, he doesn't do much of anything. And then for the next 10 years, he's preaching in Mecca. And from that point, he goes to Medina for about 10 years, comes back, conquers Mecca, and then dies a year and a half after that. In that first period where he's in Mecca, that's where he's teaching things that say things like, take care of the orphans and the widows and the wayfarer and the poor and the Jews and Christians. From among them you will find your friends. That is where you find most of this stuff at first. Interestingly, he had less than 100 followers during that time, the whole first 13 years. He doesn't have a fighting force. This is, again, according to the Hadith and the Sirah literature. Are you guys familiar with the difference between Hadith and Sirah? No? So, Sirah is the biography of Muhammad, biographical stories. So, kind of from beginning to end, the life of Muhammad. Hadith are little anecdotes, little sayings, incidents from Muhammad's life, things he has done or said. The Hadith are considered more authoritative in Islam because they come with a chain of transmission. In other words, such and such heard it from such and such, heard this from such and such, heard this from such and such, who heard it from Muhammad himself. They can trace the authority back to Muhammad, or at least they think they can. Those are the Hadith, and that's why they're given a higher status in Islam. So in Islam, it's Quran, and then it's Hadith. And the Sirah actually doesn't even enter into that chain of authority. Regardless, the Sirah and the Hadith are together on this. When Muhammad leaves Mecca and goes to Medina, the city of Medina, which is actually 5 individual tribes, all give him authority over them. He is brought in as an arbiter. Why? 3 of those tribes are Jewish, Two of those tribes are Arab. The Jews like him because he's a monotheist. The Arabs like him because he's an Arab. And so they say, you can be arbiter over all five of us. At that time, he gets an army like that. Within the first year, he starts launching raids and battles. From that point till his death, he launches an average of 9 battles a year. So when Islam was peaceful was when he had no army. And then it went from peaceful to violent the moment it could. And it continued growing in scale until he finally comes back to Mecca, takes it over, and a year and a half after that dies. And by the way, he still keeps fighting after he takes over Mecca, such that supposedly by the time Muhammad dies, Arabia is all Muslim. All the Jews and Christians are gone. By the way, why are the Jews and Christians gone? Because the Hadith, not the Sirah, now this is the Hadith, the authoritative traditions. Muhammad says, I will expel all the Jews and Christians from the Arabian Peninsula and not leave any but Muslims. That's interesting. That's Sahih Muslim, Hadith number 30. So this is the stuff he's saying. This is the stuff that's in his life. And you can see a progression towards violence. Now, the Quran talks about progressions. It says that which was revealed before can be abrogated by that which was revealed later. So if you're taking notes, chapter 2 of the Quran, verse 106, chapter 2, verse 106, and chapter 16, verse 101, both say that the text of the Quran that comes earlier can be abrogated. It can be replaced by something that comes later, which is a whole other discussion that we ought to have. Because of that, Muslims see the final teachings of Muhammad and the final way of life of Muhammad as the one that's paradigmatic for them. Now, what is the final chapter of the Quran to have been composed? Chapter 9. The most violent chapter of the Quran is the final, major chapter anyway, of the Quran to have been revealed or composed. So it works its way from peaceful to the most violent. This is the chapter that says, slay the infidels wherever you find them. This is the chapter that says, fight the Jews and Christians because they believe it, sons of God. This is the chapter that says, Allah has bought your persons and your property for this, so that you might slay in battle and be slain. Okay, the middle whole section, so like starting around verse 45 of chapter 9 says, if you're not willing to fight as a Muslim, you're not a real Muslim. That's what it says. So the Muslims in the West, such as I was, are raised in these contexts where we don't know this because the Quran is in Arabic. No one's taught us this history. These stories have been selectively left out of the biography of Muhammad as we've been told it. We're only told the bits and portions that our leaders and teachers want us to hear, and that's none of this. And so we come with this love and this passion for Islam, not knowing any of that. Whereas people who are coming into the faith, or they're really excited about the faith, they start learning the reality of what Islam is. They start learning about what it's actually taught, which is why 40% of the terrorist events in the West are by converts to Islam. And this is another one of those things when my friend David Wood, for example, is doing apologetics and he's saying Islam is false, Islam is false, Islam is false, and Christians run up to him and say, hey, you shouldn't do that. You should just love Muslims. Do you realize that he's stopping people from becoming terrorists when he does this? Stop stopping him from stopping terrorists. So that is why these converts, they get zealous and then they start joining ISIS or they start doing acts of terrorism in the West. Not all converts, of course, but 40% of those who do these acts of violence are converts, and that's a much higher percentage than there are converts in Islam. So that explains then why some Muslims will say Islam's a religion of peace and other Muslims are engaging in jihad. The ones who are consistently following Islam hermeneutically, the way it has been taught for 14 centuries, are the violent ones. Am I saying that these guys, the peaceful ones, have an illegitimate interpretation? I don't want to say that for them because you kind of decide within your own religious framework how to properly apply your hermeneutic. But what I can say is that it's irregular and it's modern and it's an invention of the recent Western Muslims to see Islam as a religion of peace. That we can say. Traditional Islam has always been the way the jihadis think it is. And they really never had a problem with that. Same thing with the Crusades. They never really had a problem with the Crusades. Muslims completely forgot the Crusades from between the Crusades until the 20th century, until the end of the 19th century. There wasn't even a word for crusade in Arabic. They never wrote about it. Why? Because they won. They won the Crusades. And they were doing the exact same thing throughout the Middle East. The invaders, the Crusader armies that were invading, actually came at the call of the Byzantine Christians after 2/3 of the Christian world had been conquered by Muslims. You know this stuff, right? 2/3 of the Christian world had been conquered by Muslims before the First Crusade was launched. It was launched entirely as a defensive effort. Was what they did holy? No, they committed atrocities. They killed Jews for no reason in the Rhineland. They slaughtered women and children in Jerusalem. I'm not defending what they did. I'm telling you what they did, which is that they launched a defensive effort after 1/3 or 2/3 of the Christian world had been conquered by Muslims. So Muslims weren't upset. They saw what was going on. They're thinking, about time you showed up to this fight. And then Christians were one of 17 interests in the Middle East at that time. And among the least relevant. They were defeated by Saladin pretty quickly. And so no one really thought about the Crusades until post-colonial narratives came into vogue at the end of the 19th century. All this, by the way, I explain in my book, Answering Jihad, pretty briefly. So I want to make sure we end with some time for you guys to ask questions. Here's what I want to tell you is happening. Muslims are seeing this. They're seeing ISIS, and they're saying, wait a minute, those guys are claiming to be Muslims, and they're taking female sex slaves. How does this happen? And some of them, maybe 1 out of every 100, will look up the hadith and see the Quran itself defends Muslims taking female sex slaves. The hadith defends Muslims taking female sex slaves. Who am I to reject the Quran and the hadith? Maybe 1 out of every 100 will do that, but that's a lot when it adds up over time. And then they're saying, either I become apathetic toward this faith, or I become an apostate, or I become radical. Those are my 3 options. And that's why we're seeing an influx in exactly those 3 categories at a faster rate than we've ever seen before. Why didn't we see this before? Oh, it's a little thing called the internet. Up until about the year 2000, 2001, if you wanted to find out any of this stuff, you had to go to an Islamic library, or you had to ask your imam. And usually that's what happened. You'd ask the imam, and they would tell you what they knew. And they probably hadn't researched this stuff, except from what they were told. So you couldn't find it. My father happened to have the 9-volume series of Sahih Bukhari at home, and it was because I went to Sahih Bukhari that I found this stuff. Other people had to wait till they got online. They start seeing the sources now through the dissemination of information. They can see, wait a minute, this is what this teaches. You told me it meant this, but this is what's... And then they're coming to this conclusion, or these conclusions. Same with the Quran. I don't know if you realize this, but only 20% of the Muslim world is Arab. And of that 20%, exactly 0% natively speaks Quranic Arabic. Everyone speaks what's called Amiya, colloquial forms of Arabic. So Egyptian Amiya is different from Moroccan Amiya, is different from Syrian, Lebanese. They can understand each other, but it's different, and it's quite different from Fusha, which is the modern standard Arabic, or classical Arabic, which is even older than that. And so for a lot of people, this information is actually inaccessible unless they can get a translation, which you now can do because of the internet. And that's exactly why the internet has been such a tool for ISIS to recruit. They can just point people to links. And guess what? That's exactly what they do. They put out a glossy magazine called Dabiq. And you can read all these magazines online. Dabiq. Only do it if you have a strong stomach. Dabiq, by the way, according to Sahih Muslim, again, one of the most reliable books of hadith, so just after the Quran basically in authority. Dabik is the field of battle where the Romans will come and attack the Muslims, and this will be the final day of judgment, and this is when Allah will usher in the end times. And so what is ISIS trying to do? A lot of people say, Nabeel, it looks like they're just trying to pick a fight. Yeah, that's exactly what they're trying to do. They're trying to pick a fight, and they want it to happen on that field so the day of judgment will be ushered in. That's why the first area they captured was Dabik, so that people would come to them and fight there. This is all related to their theology. It really, truly is. Now, am I saying that ISIS has no political agenda? I'm not saying that. Of course they have a political agenda. Everyone has political agendas. But is that their primary motivating factor? No. For Al-Qaeda, at times, yes. Politics was their agenda. For Boko Haram, not as much, but at times, yes, politics was their motivating factor. Not ISIS. Their motivating factor is theology. Yes, there is politics involved in it. But their motivating factor is theology. And they have been the most consistent about applying this stuff. So when you see them taking boys that have been captured, making them drop their pants to see if they have pubic hair, and if they do, they'll behead them. That comes from Muhammad's example. Muhammad did exactly that, according to the hadith. They're not making this stuff up. When they start selling female sex slaves for $14 per girl, that comes from Muhammad's example. Some of this stuff is a bit nuts, though. They've been taking their traders and dipping them in acid. I don't think Muhammad ever did that. So there is some stuff where they're off their rocker. But a lot of what they're doing is based on the example of Muhammad. So when you have people who want to defend out of compassion Muslims, I appreciate that. I'm thankful for that. That's my mom. That's my sister. It's my cousins, my aunts, my uncles. Thank you for looking out for Muslims. But when they do that by saying Islam is a religion of peace, they're wrong and they're endangering other Americans because they're not realizing what is the cause of this killing. It is Islam. So we need to be a light. We need to be those who can speak into the situation, dividing between Muslims and Islam. How do we do that? If you're going around saying Islam is of the devil, which I don't suggest you do, but if you do that, people are going to immediately think you hate Muslims. But if you spend your time welcoming Muslim refugees, and there are thousands of them, and you open your door to Muslims, and at the same time, you say Islam is not the true religion, the gospel is the truth. Now people will not be able to say, you hate Muslims. Proof's in the pudding, you love Muslims. And it's because you love them that you're sharing the gospel with them. And unless we can show by our love what we think about other people who are made in the image of God, people are not going to listen to what we say. Love speaks louder than we think, covers a multitude of sins. And we are meant to be the hands and feet of Christ in this situation. You've got two polar opposites here. Some people saying Islam's a religion of peace, and some people saying kick all the Muslims out. We need to be in the middle, be the voice of reason and love in the middle of this. Do we have any questions? I have about 12 minutes before I have to get running. Yes, ma'am.
When you were talking about Sita, you understood Islam to be, and that's the non-Bible. Did I understand that right?
When I was talking about the Sita? So the Sita is the biographies of Muhammad. There's many different Sita. There's Sirat Rasulullah, which is the earliest book, a biography. You have Sirat Ibn Sa'd, you have Sirat al-Tabari, different people who record histories of Muhammad. And in those books, you have the full narrative from Muhammad's life to his death and how the story went. These are not considered authoritative by Muslims. They're narratives that they often, especially Sunni Muslims, don't consider them authoritative. But no, they all show plenty of violence. There's nowhere you can turn in Muhammad's life, hadith or sira. There's nowhere you can go and find a purely peaceful Muhammad. It doesn't exist. It's not until you get to Sufi Muslims that you see a huge emphasis on love over this stuff. But even then, it's not necessarily against this stuff. So Ghazali, for example, died in 1212 AD. Both a Sufi and someone who believed in violence.
So what were you raised to understand then?
What we in the West were raised, what we in the West were raised with was a cherry-picked pastiche of Muhammad's life. That when he was a child, this happened. That when he was 25 years old, this happened. And it shows how loving and kind he was. When he was 40, he received the word of Allah, and all these people were coming against him, but he stayed strong. And he was just fighting defensive battles. Everyone was trying to kill him. And when the Muslims finally can fight, they only fight defensively. And it was because the message was so beautiful that it spread through Arabia. That's how Islam spread. That's just crazy. That does not cohere with the sources at all. But that's what we were taught in the mosques.
But yet you said you knew all of those chapters, so how did you?
Yeah, but we didn't do exegesis on the Quran. So Muslims, when they memorize sections of the Quran, they're not studying the meaning. They're memorizing the scripture, like the recitation of it. They're using it for liturgical purposes. Quite a bit like the Jews used the Hebrew of the Torah, and that's why they had to come up with the Targumim. They used the Hebrew as kind of a totem. This is holy, we need to recite this, but to understand it, let's go to the Targumim. Similarly, with the Muslims today, we recite the Quran because it in of itself is a blessing to recite. But the vast majority of them have never done an exegetical study of the Quran. Yeah. Good, glad that helps. Yes, sir. Sirah, S-I-R-A-H, Sirah. And with Arabic, just like in Hebrew, you have a different forms of it, so you can have sirat as well, but sirah is how you say it just by itself. Sir?
I work with a member of Somalia, not America. I have toyed with getting them a Somali version of the Quran. But because of what's in the Quran, I don't know whether that's wise or foolish. They do not know what's in the Quran. They only know what the Imam tells them.
So the question was, for those of you who couldn't hear, that he has friends, Somali friends, who don't really know what's in the Quran. Should he tell them what's in the Quran or not? My suggestion would be keep the conversation on Jesus. I would only bring up the Quran if that's the direction they go. And if they say, well, because the Quran says X, Y, Z, I cannot believe that about Jesus. And then you say, well, okay, fine, let's go to the Quran. Many people use a Jesus in the Quran approach. I don't like condemning other Christians. I don't like condemning their approaches. And so I'm not condemning the Jesus in the Quran approach. I'm just saying that I could never do it. Because what it does is it gives deference to the authority of the Quran. And Jesus in the Quran approach, for those of you who don't know, is going through the Quran, looking at all the places Jesus is mentioned, and saying, look, he's mentioned respectfully here, or look, there's this here, and then building a gospel presentation through those passages of the Quran. I find that problematic on many accounts. Has it been used successfully? Yes, it has. But has it been used detrimentally? Yes, it has. And so I would personally stay away from that, and I would suggest others do the same. But I won't condemn it per se. Yes, ma'am.
If you had an opportunity to have a conversation with someone that you just met and have had an opportunity to show them.
Well, I wouldn't want to script it out because every single individual is different, and so you can't have, not that you're saying do this, but we can't try to have a cookie cutter approach. But what I would do, the principle that I would give you, is to not hide your Christian faith. We tend to shy away from saying anything about Christ or something like that. It's one thing to impose it synthetically. It's not even the topic of conversation. Like, is this seat saved? Are you saved? I wouldn't go about it that way. But if they're wrestling with issues of life and death, and you just have peace in your heart that to live is Christ and to die is gain, talk about that and say, well, praise the Lord, I'm not afraid of death. And gosh, I wish you heard about the Christian message because you wouldn't be afraid of death. Make it real and just be open and vulnerable and not synthetic.
Do you offer your books to Muslims that don't know Jesus? Is that
My books are, so Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus is for, really for more westernized Muslims, Muslims raised in the West who don't really know a lot of the stuff that I didn't know. So people basically in my situation. And it's also for Western Christians who are interacting with those Muslims to help them understand Islam. Answering Jihad was specifically something I wrote after San Bernardino and after Paris. And then No God But One is for more the immigrant type of Muslims who want the evidence, who want to know why we can think the Quran is not inspired, who want to know why we can think Jesus claimed to be God, who want to explore the Trinity and how that makes sense, and Tawheed. That's what No God But One is about. So I wouldn't, if I had a Muslim friend, and I do, like in Oxford, we hang out, grab dinner every now and then. Well, actually, I did give him my book. Never mind. But I wouldn't normally see that as like operating procedure. He asked for it. Whereas it's designed for you to say, hey, here's a guy who spoke at my church, and this is what he said. What do you think? And I wouldn't say, this is all true, blah, blah, blah. I would say, look, this is what he thinks. What do you think? Let's talk about it. I'm fascinated. And you can definitely use it as a conversation starter that way. You're welcome. Yes, ma'am.
There's such a fine line between the knowledge of true Islam and what we're seeing is hard.
It is hard. It is hard. And I think we have to be the element of change we wish to see in our church. So that starts with us maybe going to the pastor. I was speaking in Dallas a couple years ago now. And there was a group within the church there that said, we want to reach out to Muslim women. We don't know what to do. 3 women. And they said, well, how about we just start cooking? And so they had those 3 women do, let's teach you how to make American dishes. You teach us how to make, I forget where they were from. I think they were from Syria. Your dishes, and we'll just cook together. And then that became bigger and bigger and bigger until they have a monthly 200 Muslim women coming to cook with 200 Christian women. And they all go and hang out at each other's house afterwards. The whole church caught the vision. Now, during the cooking classes, are we, seasoning it with, like dropping gospel hints and stuff like that? No, they're not. They're developing the relationship there, and then they're hoping those conversations happen over the table. Which is how it should happen, I think. So that's just some ideas. But Fuad Masri, no, George Husni is going to be here. George Husni will have a ton of ideas for you. Definitely talk to him about that. I've got 2 more minutes. Whose question is the most important? All right, we'll get you, and then I got to take off. So you first, sir, down here.
Very simple. How can we pray for your mother, your sister, and your father?
I appreciate that. My mother has been in the United States since 1977. And apart from me and my friends, has never been invited into a Christian home. Now, everyone just assumes somebody else is doing it. No one's doing it. So I don't want to purport to tell you how the Lord could work in their hearts. I have no idea. In my mind, it seems impossible. But for Christians to come alongside them and for them to just, get to know Christians, I think that would be great and a place to start. Their salvation, really. I promised one other guy that answers questions. So I'll just do you, and then I really sorry, guys. I'm going to have to take off and go straight to the airport. Yes, sir.
If you were writing a speech for the next president of life,
I think I would need more than a few seconds to think about that. But it would be this. It would be, we are just unwaveringly committed to people. Ideas need to be tested and checked and can be dangerous. But to people, we are unwaveringly committed. That would be where I would start, I think. But of course, that would require prayer. Someone asked me that once before too. They're like, "What would you say to Obama if you met him?" And my question would be, "Let's talk about Jesus." I mean, that would be my question. So, thank you. Thanks, everyone.